My dissertation was titled, "In University Students aged 18 to 25, what is the impact of high or low habitual physical activity on reactivity to a mental stress test?" To explore this, I originally gathered 30 participants who all wore a gene-active wrist-worn accelerometer for 7 days. Only 18 of these participants ended up reaching the wear time criteria, so these 18 participants came to the lab to take part in the TRIA social stress test. This test was split into two parts. The first part, participants were told to imagine they had applied for their dream job. They then had 5 minutes to present to the panel of people in front of them and explain why they were the best participant for this job. The second part was a mental arithmetic task. Participants had 5 minutes to sequentially subtract 17 away from 1,275 and get to as close to 0 as they could. Throughout this test, their heart rate and blood pressure was measured, once at the start, 3 times during the test, and once after the test had finished. Also, after the test had finished, participants filled out a perceived stress scale questionnaire to gauge a different form of stress to the one that was measured throughout the TRIA social stress test. My results from the study showed that there were no significant differences between the heart rate measurements, the blood pressure measurements, and the perceived stress score between these high and low physical activity groups. These results were not what I had hypothesized, but they did highlight some consistencies that other studies had suggested, such as heart rate not being a very reliable physiological measurement of stress, as it was quite inconsistent across my study and some other studies. However, my results did provide an insight, as my whole group were quite active. Even the low physical activity group was still fairly active. There weren't really much differences in the time, like the total time of physical activity between the two groups. Both of these groups did show a moderate stress response as a whole, though, suggesting that their physical activity does dampen student stress response in some way. These results allow me to conclude that physical activity does have an impact on student stress response, but more research does need to be done that involves having more distinct high and low physical activity groups, as mine weren't as distinctly separate, like high and low groups were very similar. Research also needs to be done that involves a more reliable measure of physiological stress, such as measuring cortisol. This couldn't be done during my study due to undergraduate guidelines, but can definitely be done in the future. I believe that there was definitely some elements in my study that went well. The bits of collecting accelerometer data that was in my control, such as recruiting participants, making sure they started on time and gave back the watch on time, went quite well, as did the running of the TRIA social stress test in general. Like, it ran quite smoothly, and heart rate and blood pressure measurements were all measured when they were meant to be. Most importantly, none of the participants got to a level of stress where I needed to intervene and help them, sort of way. However, what could have gone better was how some of the accelerometers worked. Some of them didn't record the amount of data necessary. Some gave up after a few days. This might have been due to like the age of the accelerometers. And the panel that I used to act as a panel in the TRIA social stress test could have been less well known to the participants, as it would have made them more stressed performing to strangers. But overall, I believe this project went pretty well, and it taught me things I maybe wouldn't have learned before, such as the programming and data processing of gene-active accelerometers. It also enhanced my organizational skills and time management skills when collecting data.